Sarah Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. At 24, she had spent the better part of her life mastering the delicate choreography of avoidance, timing her arrival at the office coffee machine to avoid crowds, choosing seats in the back row of meetings, and speaking only when directly addressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her colleagues at the marketing firm knew her as the quiet girl from accounting who always delivered error-free reports but never spoke up during presentations. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at Peterson & Associates 15 minutes early, as she always did, settling into her corner cubicle with a lukewarm cup of coffee and yesterday's unfinished spreadsheets. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar harsh glow across her workspace, which she had deliberately kept sparse and unremarkable. No family photos, no motivational quotes, no personal touches that might invite conversation or curiosity from passing coworkers. She watched through her peripheral vision as her colleagues gradually filled the office space around her. There was Jennifer from Creative, whose laugh could be heard 3 cubicles away, always animated in her discussions about weekend plans and client presentations. Marcus from Sales prowled the floor with his Bluetooth headset, closing deals with the kind of confidence Sarah could only imagine possessing. And then, there was David Chen, the department head who commanded respect simply by walking into a room, his presence somehow making everyone straighten their posture and speak more purposefully. Sarah had observed these people for 3 years, studying them like specimens in a laboratory, trying to understand the mysterious alchemy that allowed them to move through the world with such apparent ease. She catalogued their gestures, their vocal patterns, their ability to claim space in conversations and meetings. But understanding and replicating were entirely different beasts, and every attempt she had made to speak up or assert herself had resulted in the familiar burning sensation in her chest, the rapid heartbeat, the way her voice would crack and fade until she found herself apologizing for speaking at all. The transformation began with a memo. David Chen had called an all-hands meeting to discuss the company's struggling Reynolds account, a high-profile client whose dissatisfaction threatened to cost Peterson & Associates nearly 30% of their annual revenue. Sarah read the memo 3 times, her analytical mind immediately identifying several obvious solutions that seemed to have escaped the attention of the senior staff. The Reynolds Company's complaints centered around a perceived disconnect between their brand identity and the marketing campaigns Peterson & Associates had developed. They felt misunderstood, underrepresented, and increasingly convinced that their account managers simply didn't grasp the essence of their business. Sarah knew she could fix it. She had spent countless hours studying the Reynolds account during her lunch breaks, fascinated by the intricate challenge of translating a company's values into compelling marketing language. She had even drafted several alternative approaches, complete with demographic analyses and projected engagement metrics, though she had never shown these to anyone. The ideas lived in a private folder on her computer, labeled innocuously as personal projects, gathering digital dust alongside her other unspoken insights. But, knowing she could contribute and actually speaking up in front of 25 colleagues were entirely different propositions. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., and, as the hour approached, Sarah felt the familiar anxiety building in her system like a gathering storm. Her hands grew clammy, her breathing became shallow, and she found herself rehearsing phantom conversations that would never happen, imagining herself raising her hand and, then, immediately talking herself out of it. The conference room filled with the usual suspects. Senior managers claimed the seats closest to the head of the table, while junior staff arranged themselves in descending order of perceived importance. Sarah chose her customary position near the back wall, partially hidden behind Marcus's broad shoulders, where she could observe without being observed. David Chen opened the meeting with his characteristic directness. "We're in trouble," he said, pulling up a slide that showed the Reynolds account's declining engagement metrics. "They're not happy with our work, and, frankly, I can't blame them. Our last 3 campaigns have missed the mark entirely. I need fresh ideas, people. Bold thinking. Because if we lose this account, we're looking at significant layoffs." The room erupted into the familiar dance of corporate brainstorming. Jennifer suggested a complete rebranding approach that would cost more than the account was worth. Marcus proposed an aggressive social media blitz that ignored the client's explicitly stated preference for more subtle marketing tactics. Other colleagues offered variations on previous failed strategies, each speaker building on the last without anyone stepping back to question whether they were heading in the right direction. Sarah watched this unfold with growing frustration. She could see the fundamental flaw in their thinking. They were trying to fit the Reynolds Company into Peterson and Associates' existing framework instead of truly understanding what made the client unique. The Reynolds Company wasn't just another business, they were a family-owned operation that had built their reputation on personal relationships and community involvement. Their frustration stemmed from marketing campaigns that made them sound like a faceless corporation when their strength lay in their intimate connection with their customer base. 20 minutes into the meeting, after listening to the 8th iteration of essentially the same misguided strategy, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't the familiar anxiety building toward panic, but something altogether different, a kind of crystalline clarity that cut through her usual self-doubt like a blade through fog. The voice in her head that usually whispered warnings and catastrophes fell silent, replaced by a single, urgent thought: they're going to lose this account, these people are going to lose their jobs, and you're sitting here with the solution. She raised her hand. The simple gesture felt momentous, as if she had just declared war on her own nature. David Chen's eyes found hers across the room, his eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. "Sarah? Did you have something to add?" The conference room fell silent in a way that felt qualitatively different from the usual pause between speakers. This was the silence of surprise, of a familiar pattern suddenly disrupted. Sarah realized that many of her colleagues were looking at her for the first time, really seeing her as more than background furniture in the office landscape. She stood up. This was not part of her plan. She had intended to speak from her seat, to minimize her visibility while sharing her thoughts. But her body seemed to have made the decision without consulting her conscious mind, and, suddenly, she was standing at full height, looking down at the faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. "The Reynolds account isn't responding to our campaigns because we're not speaking their language," she began, her voice steady in a way that surprised her. "They're not a corporation trying to maximize market share. They're a family business trying to maintain relationships with customers they've known for 20 years. She walked to the front of the room, past Jennifer's startled expression, past Marcus's dropped jaw, until she was standing beside David Chen's presentation screen. Without asking permission, she pulled out her phone and opened the file containing her alternative campaign proposals. "Look at their marketing history," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Before they came to us, their most successful campaigns weren't about product features or competitive advantages. They were about community events, customer testimonials, and behind-the-scenes glimpses of the family members who run the business. We've been trying to make them sound like Amazon when they're actually more like the corner store that remembers your name." The room remained silent, but the quality of that silence had shifted again. This wasn't the quiet of surprise anymore, it was the focused attention of people hearing something that resonated, something that made sense of their recent failures. Sarah connected her phone to the presentation system, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. Her carefully crafted alternative campaigns filled the screen, mock-ups of advertisements that featured the Reynolds family members, social media strategies that highlighted customer relationships rather than product specifications, and a complete rebranding approach that emphasized the company's roots in the local community. "This isn't about changing who they are," she explained, clicking through the slides with growing confidence. "It's about helping them tell their story more effectively. They're proud of being a family business. They should sound like one." David Chen leaned forward in his chair, studying the slides with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for quarterly financial reports. "How long have you been working on this?" 6 months, Sarah admitted. "I've been analyzing their engagement patterns during my lunch breaks. The disconnect between their values and our messaging has been obvious for a while, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up." The silence that followed felt different again, heavier somehow, laden with implications that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. Jennifer was staring at her with something that looked like recognition, as if she was seeing Sarah clearly for the first time. Marcus had set down his phone entirely, his attention focused on the presentation with an intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand the potential impact of what he was witnessing. "These engagement projections," David said, pointing to a particularly detailed analysis on slide 12, "are they based on the Reynolds Company's historical data?" "Historical data, demographic analysis, and comparison studies with similar family-owned businesses in adjacent markets," Sarah replied. I've also been monitoring their customer feedback patterns on social media and review platforms. The messaging that resonates most strongly emphasizes personal connection and community involvement. David Chen stood up, walking closer to the screen to examine the detailed projections. These numbers suggest we could not only retain the account but actually increase their engagement metrics by 30%.
Conservative estimate, Sarah said. If we can authentically capture their family business identity, I think we could do better than that.
The transformation happening in the room was palpable. Sarah could feel the shift in how people were looking at her, not as the quiet girl from accounting who processed numbers in the background, but as someone who had been paying attention while everyone else was making assumptions. Someone who had solutions while others were simply recycling old problems. But, more significantly, Sarah could feel the transformation happening within herself. The anxiety that had defined her professional existence for 3 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something else, a kind of electric confidence that seemed to grow stronger with each word she spoke. She realized that she wasn't just presenting an alternative marketing strategy, she was presenting an alternative version of herself. Jennifer raised her hand tentatively.
Sarah, that analysis of their customer feedback patterns, did you do that on your own time?
Yes, Sarah replied, then paused, considering how much to reveal.
I've been doing independent analysis of most of our major accounts, actually.
I find it interesting to see how messaging strategies translate into measurable outcomes.
Most of our major accounts?
David's voice carried a note of incredulity.
How many accounts have you been analyzing? Sarah felt a moment of the old anxiety returning. Had she overstepped some boundary she didn't understand?
But the faces looking back at her didn't show disapproval, they showed genuine curiosity and what might have been the beginning of respect.
12 of the top 15, she admitted.
I've identified potential improvements in messaging strategy for most of them, though nothing as straightforward as the Reynolds situation.
The room erupted into a different kind of energy than Sarah had ever witnessed in a Peterson and Associates meeting.
Instead of the competitive posturing and defensive positioning she was accustomed to observing, there was a sense of collaborative excitement, of people suddenly realizing they had access to insights they hadn't known existed. David Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying not just the presentation but Sarah herself, as if he was recalibrating his understanding of someone he had known for 3 years without really knowing at all. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to acknowledge the significance of what had just occurred.
Sarah, I want you to prepare a full presentation for the Reynolds Company.
We'll schedule a meeting for next Friday, and you'll be presenting your strategy directly to their executive team. The old Sarah would have felt panic at this announcement. The prospect of presenting to clients, of being the focal point of such high-stakes attention, would have sent her spiraling into anxiety and self-doubt. But the person standing at the front of the conference room, still surprised by her own boldness, found herself nodding with something that felt remarkably like eagerness.
I'll have a complete proposal ready by Thursday, she said.
Including implementation timelines and projected metrics for the first quarter. As the meeting dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues who had rarely spoken to her before.
Jennifer wanted to know more about her analysis methodology.
Marcus was curious about her insights into the social media patterns she had identified. Even senior managers were asking questions, treating her input as valuable rather than surprising. But the most significant change was internal. Walking back to her cubicle, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she experienced her own presence in the world. The hypervigilance that had characterized her professional life, the constant monitoring of other people's reactions, the careful calculation of when to speak and when to remain silent, had been replaced by a different kind of awareness. She was still conscious of her environment and the people around her, but now that awareness felt like a source of strength rather than anxiety. That evening, Sarah stayed late in the office, not because she was behind on her regular work but because she was energized by the prospect of developing her Reynolds strategy into a comprehensive proposal. She found herself thinking differently about the space around her. Instead of trying to minimize her presence, she was claiming it. She moved her monitor to a better angle, adjusted her chair to a more comfortable height, and even brought a small plant from home to add some life to her workspace. The fluorescent lights that had always seemed harsh and unwelcoming now felt like adequate illumination for important work. The ambient noise of the building's ventilation system, which had previously felt oppressive, now provided a comfortable background for focused thinking. She was occupying the same physical space she had for 3 years, but she was occupying it differently, not as someone hiding from attention but as someone who had finally realized she had something valuable to contribute. As she worked, Sarah reflected on the day's events with a sense of bewilderment that gradually gave way to understanding. She hadn't suddenly acquired new skills or knowledge. The analytical capability she had demonstrated in the meeting had been developing quietly for months, perhaps years. What had changed was not her competence but her willingness to claim credit for that competence, to stand up and say, "I know something useful." The transformation hadn't been magical or mysterious. It had been a choice, made in a moment when the cost of remaining silent finally exceeded the cost of speaking up. She had been preparing for this moment without realizing it, developing expertise and insights that remained valuable regardless of whether anyone else recognized them. The only thing that had been missing was the courage to share what she knew. By the time Sarah left the office that night, she understood that she was not the same person who had arrived that morning. The change wasn't just professional, it was fundamental, affecting how she walked through the world, how she thought about her own capabilities, and how she related to the people around her. She had discovered something that would prove to be life-altering. The person she had always been was enough, more than enough, if she was willing to let that person be seen. Part 2, the unveiling of strength. The week following Sarah's breakthrough in the conference room unfolded like a carefully orchestrated revelation. Word of her Reynolds analysis had spread through Peterson and Associates with the kind of velocity that typically accompanied office scandals or major account losses, but, instead of whispered speculation, Sarah found herself fielding genuine requests for consultation. Colleagues who had previously offered only polite nods in the hallway were now stopping by her cubicle with questions about their own accounts, seeking the analytical perspective that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. Jennifer from Creative was the first to approach her formally. She arrived at Sarah's desk Tuesday morning with a client file and an expression that mixed professional curiosity with something that looked like respect. "I've been thinking about what you said in the meeting," Jennifer began, settling into the guest chair that Sarah had never seen occupied before. "About really understanding what makes a client unique rather than fitting them into our existing framework. I've got a situation with the Hartwell Group that's been driving me crazy for months, and I'm wondering if you'd take a look." Sarah accepted the file with hands that no longer trembled at unexpected interactions. The Hartwell Group, she discovered, was a sustainable fashion company that had been struggling to connect with younger demographics despite producing exactly the kind of ethically sourced clothing that should have resonated with environmentally conscious consumers. Jennifer's campaigns had focused heavily on the technical aspects of the manufacturing process, the organic cotton, the fair trade partnerships, the carbon-neutral shipping, but engagement remained disappointingly low. "It's like they don't care about the environment," Jennifer said, frustration evident in her voice. "I don't understand it. We're giving them exactly what they say they want." Sarah studied the demographic data and customer feedback surveys, patterns emerging from the numbers like shapes resolving from fog. The problem wasn't that younger consumers didn't care about environmental impact, it was that they were overwhelmed by environmental messaging in general. Hartwell's potential customers were suffering from what researchers had identified as eco-anxiety. They wanted to make responsible choices, but they were paralyzed by the complexity of evaluating competing environmental claims. "They don't need more information about sustainability," Sarah explained, pulling up comparative analyses on her computer screen. "They need permission to feel good about their choices. Look at these survey responses. When customers talk about brands they love, they use emotional language. They don't say, 'I appreciate the carbon-neutral shipping,' they say, 'This company makes me feel like I'm part of something important.'" Jennifer leaned closer to examine the data, her marketing instincts engaging with the insights Sarah was presenting. "So instead of explaining why our products are sustainable, you help customers imagine themselves as the kind of person who makes sustainable choices," Sarah finished. "You're not selling organic cotton, you're selling membership in a community of people who care about the future." The collaboration that followed represented uncharted territory for Sarah. She found herself working directly with Jennifer to develop messaging strategies that emphasized emotional connection over technical specifications. They spent hours analyzing successful campaigns from other industries, identifying the psychological principles that made certain approaches more effective than others. What surprised Sarah most was how natural this collaboration felt. She had always assumed that her analytical approach would clash with creative thinking, but she discovered that data and creativity could enhance each other in powerful ways. Jennifer's intuitive understanding of visual communication combined with Sarah's systematic analysis of consumer psychology created campaigns that were both emotionally resonant and strategically sound. By Thursday afternoon, they had developed a complete rebranding strategy for Hartwell that focused on personal identity and community belonging rather than product specifications. The tagline Jennifer had created, "Your future self will thank you," captured exactly the aspirational messaging that Sarah's analysis had identified as most effective with the target demographic. David Chen's reaction to their collaborative work was immediate and decisive. He promoted Sarah to senior marketing analyst on the spot, a position that came with a 30% salary increase and, more significantly, formal recognition as a strategic resource for the entire agency. The promotion also meant relocating to a private office, a physical transformation that felt symbolic of the broader changes occurring in Sarah's professional identity. The new office space represented more than just increased square footage and better lighting. It was a declaration that Sarah's contributions were valuable enough to merit investment, that her insights deserved the kind of environment where important work could be conducted. She spent an entire afternoon arranging the space to reflect her new role, adding bookshelves for the marketing psychology texts she had been reading privately for years, wall space for the data visualizations that helped her identify patterns, and a proper conference table where she could meet with colleagues and clients. But the most significant change was not physical, it was the evolution in how Sarah understood her own relationship to her work and her colleagues. The hypervigilance that had characterized her first 3 years at Peterson and Associates had been replaced by what she could only describe as strategic awareness. Instead of monitoring other people's reactions to gauge whether she was being too visible or too vocal, she now paid attention to group dynamics in order to identify when her analytical perspective would be most valuable. This shift in awareness allowed her to recognize patterns in office interactions that she had previously missed while focused on her own anxiety. She began to notice when meetings were stalling because people were avoiding difficult conversations, when projects were struggling because teams were working with incomplete information, when clients were dissatisfied because their actual needs weren't being addressed. The Reynolds presentation, scheduled for Friday morning, became a test case for Sarah's evolved approach to professional interaction. Instead of dreading the client meeting, she found herself looking forward to it with something that felt remarkably like excitement. She had spent the week refining her analysis, developing implementation strategies, and preparing for the kinds of questions that executive teams typically asked when evaluating marketing proposals. Thursday evening, she stayed late in her new office, not because she needed more preparation time but because she wanted to ensure that every aspect of her presentation reflected the thoroughness that had become her professional signature. She had learned that her analytical approach was not a limitation to be overcome but a strength to be leveraged. Where other strategists might rely on intuition or industry best practices, Sarah could demonstrate her recommendations with data that clients could understand and trust. The presentation itself unfolded with a smoothness that surprised everyone involved, including Sarah. The Reynolds executive team, which had grown increasingly skeptical of Peterson and Associates' ability to understand their business, responded to Sarah's family-focused strategy with immediate enthusiasm. They recognized themselves in her analysis, saw their values reflected in her messaging recommendations, and understood intuitively that someone had finally taken the time to understand what made their company unique. "This is exactly what we've been trying to communicate for years," said Rebecca Reynolds, the company's marketing director and daughter of the founder. "You've captured our voice in a way that we couldn't even articulate ourselves." The contract renewal was signed that afternoon, along with an expanded scope of work that would increase the account value by 40%. David Chen's congratulations carried a note of something that sounded like amazement, as if he was still processing the transformation he had witnessed in his formerly invisible employee. But, for Sarah, the most meaningful aspect of the successful presentation was not the professional recognition or the account retention. It was the realization that she had been preparing for this moment for years without knowing it. Every lunch hour spent analyzing client data, every evening spent reading marketing psychology research, every quiet observation of office dynamics had been building toward a competence that she was finally willing to claim.
The weeks that followed established a new rhythm in Sarah's professional life.
Her calendar filled with consultation requests from colleagues seeking her analytical perspective on challenging accounts. Senior managers began including her in strategic planning sessions, recognizing that her systematic approach to understanding client psychology could inform decisions across the agency. She found herself participating in client meetings not as a silent observer but as a primary contributor, someone whose insights were actively sought and valued. The transformation in how others perceived her was matched by an equally significant evolution in how she perceived herself. The anxiety that had defined her professional experience for 3 years didn't disappear entirely, but it was recontextualized. Instead of anxiety about being seen, she occasionally experienced excitement about being heard. Instead of fear of judgment, she felt anticipation about sharing insights that could solve problems. More fundamentally, Sarah began to understand that her previous invisibility had not been the result of some inherent inadequacy but, rather a choice, unconscious perhaps, but still a choice, to prioritize comfort over contribution. She had been capable of the analytical work that was now earning recognition all along. What had changed was her willingness to make that capability visible to others. This realization extended beyond her professional life into personal territory she had previously considered immutable. The social anxiety that had made networking events torturous began to diminish as she realized that she had valuable perspectives to share in those environments as well. The fear of speaking up in group settings was replaced by curiosity about how her analytical approach might contribute to various conversations. 6 weeks after her first presentation to the Reynolds team, Sarah found herself delivering a keynote address at the Regional Marketing Association's annual conference. The topic, Data-Driven Empathy, Using Analytics to Understand Customer Psychology, represented a synthesis of everything she had learned about combining systematic analysis with genuine understanding of human motivation. Standing on the conference stage, looking out at an audience of 200 marketing professionals, Sarah experienced a moment of crystalline clarity about the nature of the transformation she had undergone. She had not become a different person, she had become willing to be the person she had always been. The analytical mind, the systematic approach to problem solving, the ability to identify patterns that others missed, these had been her characteristics for years. What had changed was not her capabilities but her courage to share them. The audience's response to her presentation was immediate and enthusiastic. Marketing directors approached her afterward with business cards and collaboration proposals. Industry publications requested interviews. Speaking opportunities multiplied faster than she could evaluate them. But, perhaps the most significant indicator of her transformation was internal. Walking through the conference venue, engaging in conversations with industry leaders, exchanging ideas with peers she had previously only read about in marketing journals, Sarah realized that she felt entirely comfortable in her own skin. The hypervigilance that had characterized her interactions for so many years had been replaced by genuine curiosity about other people's experiences and perspectives. The person who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility had evolved into someone who could command attention not through force or manipulation but through the simple act of sharing valuable insights. She had discovered that respect was not something to be earned through self-diminishment but something that naturally accompanied genuine competence expressed with confidence. As the conference concluded and Sarah prepared to return to Peterson and Associates, she carried with her the understanding that her transformation was not complete but ongoing. Each new challenge, each client interaction, each opportunity to contribute her analytical perspective was another step in the process of becoming fully herself in professional contexts. The shy accountant who had raised her hand in a conference room 6 weeks earlier had evolved into a recognized expert whose insights were sought by industry leaders. But, more importantly, she had learned that the strength to transform herself had been present all along, waiting not for external validation but for internal permission to emerge. Part 3, The Destroyer of Weakness. 3 months after her breakthrough in the Reynolds meeting, Sarah Martinez stood in her corner office watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the Peterson and Associates building. The view from the 15th floor revealed a city awakening to its daily rhythms, and she found herself reflecting on how profoundly her perspective had shifted since those early days of strategic invisibility. The woman who had once timed her coffee breaks to avoid human interaction was now preparing to address the agency's largest client presentation of the year. The Meridian Corporation account represented everything that would have terrified the previous version of Sarah, a multinational technology company whose marketing budget exceeded the GDP of small nations, executives who measured every interaction in terms of bottom-line impact, and stakes so high that failure could reshape the entire trajectory of Peterson and Associates. The presentation scheduled for that afternoon would either secure the most lucrative contract in the agency's history or confirm Meridian's growing suspicion that Peterson and Associates lacked the strategic sophistication to represent a global technology leader. But Sarah approached the challenge with a calm confidence that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. She had spent 6 weeks conducting the most comprehensive market analysis of her career, developing insights into Meridian's customer psychology that went far deeper than their previous marketing firms had attempted. The presentation materials spread across her conference table represented not just professional work but a manifestation of her evolved understanding of her own capabilities. The transformation had accelerated exponentially after the Regional Marketing Association keynote. Speaking requests arrived daily from conferences, universities, and corporate training programs. Marketing Week had featured her on their cover with the headline, "The Analytics Whisperer: How One Quiet Analyst Revolutionized Customer Psychology." Harvard Business Review had published her article on data-driven empathy, which had been downloaded more than 50,000 times in its first month. But the external recognition, while gratifying, was not what mattered most to Sarah. The truly significant change was internal, a fundamental shift in how she understood her relationship to challenge, conflict, and the inevitable difficulties that accompanied ambitious professional goals. The anxiety that had once paralyzed her in high-stakes situations had been replaced by what she could only describe as strategic excitement, an energizing anticipation of complex problems that required her particular combination of analytical rigor and psychological insight. The Meridian presentation would test every aspect of this evolution. The client's executives had rejected 3 previous proposals from Peterson and Associates, each time citing the same fundamental criticism: the campaigns felt generic, divorced from any authentic understanding of what motivated Meridian's customers to choose technology solutions. They were seeking something that transcended traditional marketing approaches, something that demonstrated genuine insight into the psychological factors that drove purchasing decisions in the enterprise software market. Sarah's analysis had identified something that previous marketing teams had missed entirely. Meridian's potential customers, IT directors and chief technology officers at large corporations, were not primarily motivated by technical specifications or cost savings. They were motivated by fear. Fear of making decisions that could compromise their company's competitive positions. Fear of implementing systems that might fail under pressure. Fear of being held responsible for technology choices that didn't deliver promised results. Traditional marketing approaches had focused on Meridian's product's strengths: faster processing speeds, better security features, more efficient integration capabilities. But Sarah's research revealed that technical superiority was assumed by potential customers. What they desperately needed was reassurance that choosing Meridian would not expose them to career-threatening risks. "It's not about convincing them that our technology is better," she had explained to David Chin during their preparation session. "It's about helping them feel confident that choosing us is the safe decision, the smart decision, the decision that positions them as forward-thinking leaders rather than reckless gamblers." This insight had led to a complete reconceptualization of Meridian's marketing strategy. Instead of focusing on product features, Sarah's campaign emphasized risk mitigation, industry validation, and peer endorsement. Instead of targeting decision-makers with technical specifications, her approach addressed their psychological need for security and professional validation. The presentation materials she had developed told a story that potential customers could see themselves in: successful IT leaders who had strengthened their company's competitive positions by making thoughtful technology choices. The messaging emphasized not what Meridian's products could do, but what choosing Meridian would say about the intelligence and strategic thinking of the decision-maker. As the afternoon presentation time approached, Sarah found herself entering a mental state that had become familiar over the past months, a kind of focused clarity that seemed to slow time and sharpen her awareness of every relevant detail. She was no longer the person who rehearsed phantom conversations or imagined catastrophic outcomes. Instead, she was someone who prepared thoroughly, trusted her analysis, and approached high-stakes interactions with genuine curiosity about how her insights would resonate with the audience. The Meridian executive team arrived precisely on time, their professional demeanor carrying the subtle tension of people who had been disappointed repeatedly and were prepared for another unsatisfactory experience. Chief Marketing Officer Rachel Kim led the group, her reputation in the technology industry built on an ability to identify marketing strategies that delivered measurable business results. Behind her came Technology Director Michael Torres and Strategy Vice President Jennifer Liu, all of them carrying tablets and expressions of polite skepticism. Sarah began her presentation not with slides or statistics, but with a question that immediately captured their attention. What keeps you awake at night when you're considering a major technology decision? The question was strategic, designed to surface the exact psychological concerns that her analysis had identified as central to their customers' decision-making process. Rachel Kim's response confirmed everything Sarah had discovered in her research: the fear that we'll implement something that seems perfect in the demo but fails when we need it most. That's exactly what your customers are feeling, Sarah replied, advancing to her first slide, which displayed not technical specifications but survey data about enterprise technology decision-makers' primary concerns. They're not questioning whether your products work. They're questioning whether choosing you will make them look smart or expose them to blame if something goes wrong. The presentation that followed represented Sarah's most sophisticated synthesis of data analysis and psychological insight. She walked the Meridian team through customer journey maps that revealed the emotional stages of enterprise technology adoption, from initial curiosity through implementation anxiety to post-purchase validation. Each stage of the journey was supported by research data, customer interviews, and behavioral analysis that demonstrated a level of understanding that went far beyond traditional marketing approaches. Your current marketing speaks to their rational minds, Sarah explained, displaying side-by-side comparisons of Meridian's existing campaigns and her proposed alternatives. But people don't buy enterprise software with their rational minds. They buy with their emotional minds and, then, use their rational minds to justify the decision afterward. The shift in the room's energy was palpable. Rachel Kim leaned forward in her chair, her professional skepticism giving way to genuine engagement. Michael Torres stopped checking his phone and began taking notes. Jennifer Liu asked increasingly sophisticated questions about implementation timelines and measurement strategies. But the moment that Sarah knew she had fundamentally altered their understanding of the challenge came when Rachel Kim paused the presentation to ask, "Has anyone ever analyzed our customer psychology this thoroughly before?" "No," Sarah replied with the kind of confident directness that would have been impossible for her 6 months earlier. Most marketing firms focus on what you want to say rather than what your customers need to hear. We built this entire strategy around understanding the psychological journey your customers go through when making technology decisions. The conversation that followed extended far beyond the scheduled presentation time. The Meridian executives found themselves exploring not just the proposed marketing strategy but the underlying psychological principles that informed Sarah's approach. They discussed implementation challenges, measurement methodologies, and the long-term implications of marketing that addressed customer psychology rather than simply promoting product features. When Rachel Kim finally called for a break, she pulled Sarah aside with an expression that mixed professional admiration with genuine curiosity. "I've been in technology marketing for 15 years, she said, "and I've never seen analysis that goes this deep into customer psychology. How did you develop this approach?" Sarah's response surprised even herself with its clarity and confidence. "I realized that data without empathy is just noise, and empathy without data is just assumption. The magic happens when you combine systematic analysis with genuine understanding of human motivation." The contract that Meridian signed that evening was the largest in Peterson and Associates history, but, for Sarah, the financial success was secondary to the professional validation. She had not only solved a complex marketing challenge but had done so by leveraging the analytical approach that had always been her strength. The woman who had once hidden her insights in private computer folders was now being sought out by industry leaders specifically because of the depth and sophistication of her analytical perspective. But the Meridian success represented more than professional achievement. It was confirmation of a fundamental transformation in how Sarah understood herself and her relationship to challenge. The fear that had once paralyzed her in high-stakes situations had been replaced by something that felt remarkably like hunger, an eagerness to engage with complex problems that required everything she had learned about combining data analysis with psychological insight.
The months that followed established Sarah as one of the most sought-after marketing strategists in the industry. Her client list expanded to include Fortune 500 companies seeking the kind of customer psychology analysis that had become her signature approach. Speaking engagements evolved from regional conferences to international symposiums where marketing leaders gathered to discuss the future of customer engagement. Yet the most significant aspect of her transformation was not the external recognition but the internal shift that had made such recognition possible. Sarah had learned to distinguish between the fear that protected her from genuine danger and the fear that simply protected her from discomfort. The anxiety that had once felt overwhelming now served as useful information, alerting her to situations that required additional preparation or strategic thinking rather than paralyzed avoidance. She had also discovered something profound about the nature of professional confidence. Real confidence, she realized, was not the absence of uncertainty but the presence of competence to navigate uncertainty effectively. The person who had once avoided challenging situations now sought them out, not because she had eliminated the possibility of failure but because she had developed the skills and resilience to learn from whatever outcomes emerged. The transformation had extended into every aspect of her life. The woman who had once declined social invitations now hosted networking events in her home. The person who had avoided leadership responsibilities now mentored junior analysts, sharing the systematic approach to customer psychology that had become her professional foundation. The individual who had once measured success by how little attention she attracted now measured it by how much value she could contribute to complex challenges. 1 year after her breakthrough in the Reynolds meeting, Sarah found herself standing on a stage at the International Marketing Summit, delivering a keynote address to an audience of 3,000 marketing professionals. The topic, From Invisible to Influential, the Psychology of Professional Transformation, represented not just her expertise in customer analysis but her hard-won understanding of personal evolution. The person who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, she concluded, borrowing from the philosophical principle that had guided her transformation. But that destruction is not violent, it's revelatory. It's the process of discovering that the strength you need was present all along, waiting not for external validation but for internal permission to emerge. The standing ovation that followed felt significant not because of its duration or intensity, but because Sarah received it with the kind of grounded confidence that had replaced her former anxiety. She was no longer surprised by recognition of her competence, she expected it because she had learned to recognize and value that competence herself. As she prepared to leave the stage, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from corporate invisibility to industry leadership. The transformation had not been magical or mysterious, it had been the result of consistent choices to engage with challenge rather than avoid it, to share insights rather than hoard them, to trust her analytical capabilities rather than doubt them. The woman who had once perfected the art of being invisible had become someone who commanded attention not through force or manipulation but through the simple act of contributing genuine value. She had learned that respect was not earned through self-diminishment but naturally accompanied competence expressed with confidence. But, perhaps most importantly, she had discovered that the strength to transform herself had been present throughout her years of strategic hiding. The analytical mind that now earned industry recognition had been developing quietly during those lunch hours spent studying client data. The psychological insights that clients now sought had been forming during those careful observations of office dynamics and customer behavior patterns. The transformation had not created new capabilities, it had revealed existing strengths that had been masked by fear and self-doubt. The person she had become was not different from the person she had always been, she was simply willing to be that person fully, publicly, and without apology. Standing in the wings of the International Marketing Summit, preparing to return to her life as someone whose insights shaped industry conversations, Sarah understood that her journey represented something larger than individual professional development. She had proven that transformation was possible not through acquiring new skills but through claiming existing ones, not through becoming someone different but through becoming authentically herself. The weak self that had been destroyed was not her analytical nature, her careful approach to problem solving, or her preference for systematic thinking. The weak self had been the fear that these characteristics were insufficient, the doubt that her perspective was valuable,
the anxiety that prevented her from sharing what she knew. In destroying that weak self, not through violence but through revelation, she had become indestructible in the ways that mattered most. No client rejection could now convince her that her analytical approach lacked value. No professional setback could persuade her that her insights were irrelevant. No social situation could reduce her to the hypervigilant observer she had once been. She had learned that the strongest foundation for confidence was not the absence of weakness but the integration of strength. The person who knows her capabilities and trusts her judgment cannot be diminished by others' opinions or defeated by external circumstances. She becomes, in the truest sense, indestructible not because she cannot be challenged, but because she has the inner resources to meet whatever challenges arise. The journey from invisible to influential had taught Sarah that transformation was not about becoming someone else but about becoming fully oneself. The person who destroys the weak self, the fearful, doubtful, hidden self, reveals the strong self that was present all along. And that strong self, once acknowledged and embraced, becomes a foundation that no external force can shake. As she walked through the conference venue, engaging in conversations with industry leaders who sought her perspectives on customer psychology and strategic analysis, Sarah carried with her the understanding that her transformation was complete not because she had reached some final destination but because she had learned to navigate the journey with confidence. She had become the kind of person who could face any professional challenge with curiosity rather than fear, who could contribute to any conversation with genuine insight rather than anxious self-monitoring. The woman who had once hidden in corporate conference rooms had evolved into someone whose voice shaped industry conversations. But, more importantly, she had learned that the power to transform herself had been hers all along, she had simply needed the courage to claim it.